an apology for poetry. Ang isa pang definition niya dyan ay the defense of poesy. Okay, poesy, poetry. Okay? So, kahit ano rito ang gamitin ninyo, an apology for poetry or the defense of poesy, both are accepted titles nung gawa ni Sir Philip Sidney. Okay. So, sino ba si Sir Philip Sidney? Okay, ito yung gwapong-gwapong si Sir Philip Sidney. Ayan. So, siguro kung kayo nabubuhay ng time na yan, alam na. Okay? So, Sir Philip Sidney was one of the founders of Humanist tradition of the English verse. So, 400 years ago in London, he founded a society which he called the Aeropagus. So, bumuo sila ng grupo na kung tawagin nila ay Aeropagus. Okay. So, ano bang ginagawa nila? Parang ano to parang yung Dead Poet Society. Parang ganon. Okay? So, during their meetings, religious and philosophical problems were discussed and new forms of poetry were worked out. So, para siya naging literary movement. Okay? So, kaya siya naging literary movement because they would like to standardize, if that's the right term, or to develop or to improve poetry during their time or literature during their time. Okay, so the Defense of Poetry by Philip Sidney was a theoretical work, philosophical, aesthetical, may kulang na letter A, is aesthetical creed of the new poetry founders. Okay, so nabuo yung Defense of Poetry, sang-ayon na rin dito sa grupo nila. Okay, doon nakakuha si Sir Philip Sidney ng mga ideas, ng mga concepts when he developed or when he made the Defense of Poetry. And the main object of poetry after Sidney is considered to be the positive influence on the individual's mentality. Again, humanity, humanist tradition. Okay, humanist tradition ang sinusundan nila. Okay, the significance or relevance of human existence. And it is necessary for the poet to create an ideal character and to convince the reader to believe in such perfect character. The writers must face their characters to difficulties and make them improve their souls. So ng parang ang lakas ng impluwensya ni Aristotle dito, 'di ba? Sabi 'di ba nga si Aristotle sabi niya sa a hero. Ang hero dapat mabait, mayroong magandang pag-uugali, dapat pahirapan mo yung hero mo. Huwag mo siyang gawing masyadong perfect na kayang malampasan lahat. So, bigyan mo siya ng tragic flow, harmansya. Yan, pahirapan mo siya. Okay? So, dun pa lang, may pagka-Aristotelian yung concept ni Philip Sidney rito, no? Although we don't have a direct proof na dun nga, but looking at the thinking of Philip Sidney, parang may impluwensya nga naman siya. We can assume na mayroong impluwensya dito sa dito sa statement na ito, yung yung Aristotelian concept. Okay, so ano ba yung pinanggalingan nito? Okay. So ito yung sinasabi ko sa inyo na pinaghugutan ni Sir Philip Sidney nung kanyang Defense of Poesy or Defense of Poetry or Poesy. So in 1579, Stephen Gosson published a short book, The School of Abuse. Ang bigat ng title, 'di ba? School of Abuse. So parang para may pagka Platonian tong si Gosson. Okay. So virtually attacking poets and actors and questioning the morality of fictitious work. Just like Plato, 'di ba? So si Plato, 'di ba, kino-question niya rin yung morality of the literary works that uh, people are not actually getting something good from the literary works Because, uh, sabi niya nga is makamundong paghahangad ang pinapakita at ang ginamit niyang example is the Iliad and Odyssey. Okay? So, kaya si Gosson, meron ding the same view as Plato when he attacked poets and actors wherein sabi niya questioning the morality of fictitious works. Okay? So, in response to that, in 1580, Sidney wrote The Defense of Poesy, or also known as An Apology for Poetry. So, para siyang si Aristotle dito na ito yung sagot niya doon kay Gosson. Okay? Pero tingnan natin, ano ba yung ano ba talaga yung stand ni Sidney? Entirely siya ba ay may pagka-Platonian o siya ba ay Aristotelian entirely? Or baka uso naman ang mix and match, baka halo. Let's try to discover it as we go through with our discussion. Okay? So, the comments of Gosson did not address specifically to Philip Sidney, but it motivated Sidney to write his own opinions on the subject. Okay, again, hindi naman direct lang sinasabi ni Gosson na ang atake niya ay kay Sidney. But since si Sidney ay isa yung bahagi ng isang organization wherein uh, as part of their organization, they are into developing or improving uh, poetry during their time. Okay? So, hindi mo talaga may tatakwil o may aalis kay Philip Sidney na dumipensa. Kasi meron silang literary movement eh. Diba? Meron silang literary movement. Okay. In Sidney's work, The Defense of Poesy, he defended poetry, discussed the opposition to poetry, such as the common cavalier notion of practical knowledge in a small discussion on linguistics. Okay? So, may kinalaman nito ngayon sa stylistics. Kung kayo may subject stylistic, style, and linguistics. Okay? Ayan. So, it raises issues such as the value and function of poetry, the nature of imitation, and the concept of nature. So, itong pag-aaralan natin. Okay. Isa-isahin natin ngayon yung mga charges ni Gosson at kung papaano ba dinipensahan ni Sidney ito. Okay? So, let's have the first one. So, there are other kinds of knowledge more fruitful than poetry. Yung parang Plato. Sabi ni Gosson, there are other kinds of knowledge more fruitful than poetry. Para kay Plato, di ba, ang mas fruitful is philosophy at useless ang poetry. So, parang katulad siya si Gosson, parang katulad ni Plato. So, there are more fruitful than poetry. So, ito ang sabi ni Sidney. No, poetry is the source of knowledge and a civilizing force. Okay, yun yung stand niya. Poetry corrupts the people and it is the waste of time. Sabi ni Gosson. Pero sabi naman ni Sidney, no learning is so good as that which teaches and moves to virtue, and that nothing can both teach and amuse so much as poetry does. So sabi niya, in poetry, teach and delight. Diba? Na-discuss natin yung teach and delight. Yung kay Aristotle na teach and delight. So sabi ni Aristotle doon na as you teach, there should be a delightfulness. And as you become delightful, so yung wants mo na-attain, diba? Okay? So, teach and delight, ito yung teach and amuse. May pagka-Aristotelian itong paniniwalang ito ni Sidney sa puntong ito. Okay? Teach and amuse so much as poetry does. So, sabi niya, kapag ang poetry, hindi lang siya nagtuturo sa atin. Nagbibigay rin siya ng entertainment or amusement to us. Another one. Sabi ni Sidney, in essay societies, poetry was the main source of education. As an example, sabi niya, he remembers ancient Greek society that respected poets. Okay? So, hindi naman natin maikakailabag naman nandoon si Plato. Tinuturo pa rin ang poetry as part of learnings ng mga bata. Of course, in other school, not on the not on the in the academy, yung eskwelahan ni Plato. So the poets are always to be looked up. So poetry is not a waste of time. Okay? Sidney states that the greatest gifts bestowed upon human beings are oratio and ratio. Oratio and ratio. Okay? Oratio, oral speech. Okay? Oral speech. Speech and reason. Okay? So, sabi niya, this gift of man being someone who can express their thoughts and ideas, someone who can dealt with reasons, someone that can express reasons. So these are the two greatest gifts of human being. At ito ay reflect ng poetry. Next, still in defense on the first attack. Sabi ni Sidney defended that it is poetry which most polishes the gift of speech, and it far exceed prose on two accounts. Okay? Bakit daw? Sabi niya, because it engenders delight because of its meticulous ordering of words, and it is memorable. So sabi niya, kapag ikaw ay nag-aaral ng poetry, na-i-improve daw yung speaking skill mo, or the way you speak. Okay? Because itong sinasabi niya, because of its meticulous ordering of words. Kaya nga 'di ba kapag nagbabasa tayo ng poetry, parang merong rhythm. Para 'di ba most of the poetries are intended to be sung. So, yung ritmo, yung tamang phrasing, so parang it gives us a sense of delight when we studied or when we are reading poetry. Okay? So, yun yung isa sa mga justification niya. Okay, and again, it is memorable. Madali, since most of the literary works are in verse, naka-verse. So, madali may mga quotable quotes na tumatatak sa ating isipan, and that what makes it memorable. Okay? So, ito yung mga justification niya kung bakit nakakatulong ang poetry when it comes to polishing the gift of speech. Since knowledge depends on memory, poetry is an affinity with knowledge. Okay? Basic lang yung kanyang panliwanag dyan. Dahil marami nagkakabisado ng mga tula, kinakabisado yung mga tula. Well, of course, when you memorize daw, it enhances your knowledge. Moreover, since poetry teacheth, moveth to virtue. Old English kasi yung source. Kaya teacheth and moveth to virtue. There can be no more fruitful knowledge than poetry. Okay? So, yun yung kanyang reason. Very basic lang yung paliwanag niya kung bakit yung sinabing fruitful ang poetry. Una, it enhances our speaking skill. And as we read or as we deliver the lines of poetry, it gives us a sense of delight. And since there are many poetries that we are into memorizing, it enhances our knowledge. And with that, hindi po pwedeng sabihin ni Goso na hindi fruitful ang poetry when it comes to enhancing our knowledge. Okay? So that's the basic explanation of of Sidney with regard to the first attack. Attack talaga yung term eh. Ito pang mabigat na sinabi ni Gosson. Poetry is the mother of lies. Saan yung ba ito pinagkukuha? Kasi nga 'di ba, with the parang with the influence of Plato. 'Di ba si Plato doon sa theory of mimesis. First creator is God, and when you as a human being, when you imitate another one, ikaw na yung pangalawang imitation, at yung isa na imitate na naman yung another creation, nagkakaroon na ngayon the more na nagkakaroon ng imitation, just like a painting, the more na nagkakaroon ng pagputol ng reality, hence creation of lies. So that's the thought of Gauson. Kaya niya sinabing poetry is the mother of lies. Besides, just like Plato, naniniwala din siya na uh, yung human desire lamang ang pinapakita or inilalahad ng mga poetries. Okay, so Sidney's famous retort is that the poet nothing affirms and therefore never lie. Wala naman daw gustong patunayan ng poetry eh. Wala naman siyang gustong patunayan eh. So, di naman niya pinapatunayan na totoo yung kanya. Neither pinapatotohanan niya or uh, pina the other side of that. Okay, so wala naman siyang gustong patunayan at hence wala naman siyang sinasabing lie. Okay, so Sidney defended that the poet does not claim to be telling the truth. He is not relating what is or is not, but what should or should not be. He is writing not affirmatively, but allegorically and figuratively. Okay, allegorically and figuratively. Okay, allegorical, ibig sabihin meron kang pinagkukunang reference mo. Diyan magaling si Edmund Spencer. So, doon sa mga ano niya, yung works niya kasi it's an allegory of Queen Victoria and Queen Elizabeth, yung mga monarchs. Pero behind that, tinutuligsan niya na pala yung mga monarchs and even the religion. Okay, allegorical din and figuratively. So kapag tinake mo ito ng tinake mo siya as literally, of course, talaga masasabihin mo na hindi yun makatotohanan. But sabi ni Sidney, ang style namin, no, ang style kasi namin is allegorical and figurative. Okay? The poetic truths are ideal and universal, therefore poetry cannot be a mother of lies. Okay? Third attack is poetry abused man's wit, training it to wanton sinfulness and lustful love. Wanton, lustful, para lang yan halos. So, yung wanton sinfulness, yung grabing kasalanan. Okay? So, Sidney defended that it is with particular poets who have abused their art, not with the art itself. So, sabi ni Sidney, wag niyong idamay ang poetry. Ang tulig sa inyo, yung mga poet. Kung yung mga poet nagsusulat ng something na mali, silang tulig sa inyo, but do not attack the entire poetry. Do not generalize that all poetry are abusing men's wit, training wanton sinfulness and lustful love. Yun yung sabi ni Sidney. So kung mayroon man kayong nakitang pagkakamali doon sa isang poetry, do not attack the poetry entirely. So attack the poets themselves. Sila may kasalanan doon. Kaya sabi niya dyan, di ba, it is with particular poet who have abused their art, not with the art itself. Okay? Sidney explained that it is not that poetry abused man's wit, but that man's wit abused poetry. So, hindi naman tinatanggi kaya nga di ba sabi niya sa una, he is not lie, poetry does not lie. Okay? And poetry does not neither affirm nor reject yung view ni Gauson. But according to him, poetry does not abuse man's wit. It is man's wit that abuse poetry. Hence, it's the poet. So kung ang poet nagsusulat ng something na mali, something wrong, then attack the poet, not the poetry in general. Parang ano lang yan, sino ba yun yung nag-attack sa Luwalhati Bautista? Ayan. Another one, poetry abuses are more nursed by philosophy and history than by poetry. Ayan. By describing battles, bloodshed, violence, etc. Okay, clear naman dito sinasabi ni Philip Sidney na mas ano pa nga ang philosophy tsaka history kaysa sa poetry, kasi poetry allegorical tsaka figurative. So kumbaga, let's say na romanticize, may pahaging lang. Pero ang philosophy tsaka history, direkta nilang inaatake. Yung direkta nilang dinidescribe yung battles, bloodshed and violence. So Poetry never abused men's wit. In the contrary, poet helps to maintain morality and peace by avoiding such violence and bloodsheds. Moreover, it brings light to knowledge. So, yan ang sabi ni, ni Sidney. So, di nila pinopromote itong battles or bloodshed or violence, etc. But what they are trying to point out when we talk of poetry is that what can we get from it? What lessons can we get from it? And with that, there is a teach and delight. Okay, so yun yung mga atake ni Gosson and the responses of uh, of of Philip Sidney. Okay? And now, these are the key features to understand the Renaissance literary criticism based on the defensive policy. Um, base doon sa defense niya, paano lang ngayon natin gagamitin ito when it comes to analyzing literature? So, paano natin sila pwedeng gamitin? Okay. Una, the theory of imitation. So, balikan ulit natin ito. So, the Renaissance critics' theory of imitation is different from that of Plato and Aristotle. Different from that of Plato and Aristotle. Let's see kung bakit pa siya naging iba. Baka dahil hindi siya plainly Platonian, hindi siya plainly Aristotelian. Okay, so imitation for Plato and Aristotle was the imitation of persons and things and nature. Horace and Longinus use it as meaning the imitation of other writers. This latter sense is the one in which it was most often used by the Renaissance. Yung definition nila ng imitation during the Renaissance period is the imitation of other writers. So which is far different from the imitation of person ni Plato and imitation of things in nature. Okay, things in nature. So, para sa kanila, when talk of imitation, ng imitation during the Renaissance period, it is how the writers imitate other writers. Okay, ganun yung pagkakaunawa nila ng imitation. Ibang-iba doon sa paniniwala nila Aristotle at ni Plato ng imitation. Okay? So, again, ang imitation during the Renaissance period is how others imitate other writers. Kumbaga parang ano lang yan, you get inspiration from the other writers and copy their style. Ganun lang siya. Okay, so, since Plato has a view on imitation, let's try just have to recap on that. So Plato views that art is the imitation of nature, but it is not slavish imitation. Rather, it is only just a creative imitation. So if it is a creative imitation, pag sinabi natin creative imitation, ibig sabihin lamang yan, hindi na to yung authentic. Okay? So, basta kay Plato, pag sinabi mo creative imitation, it's not an authentic one. Kaya nga, imitation lang siya. For Sidney, nature is dull, incomplete, and ugly. Okay? So, medyo iba na ngayon yung view niya. So, nature is dull, incomplete, and ugly. So, it is artists who turn dull nature into golden color. Okay? So, mababalikan natin, di ba? Sabi niya nga, nung sa defense sa poetry niya, yung sa defense niya doon sa isa sa sinabi ni Gosson, kung minention ko kanina sa inyo, na sabi ni Sidney doon, wag mo atakihin ang poetry. Ang nagpapapangat sa poetry ay ang poet mismo. The same is true with kung ano yung pangit doon sa nakikita ng poetry, kumukuha siya doon ng essence. So, katulad, diba, na nabanggit natin kanina na it's the philosophy and history that tackles bloodshed, battles, in such a way na gruesome na yung description. Pero, iba ang atake ni poetry, sabi ni Sidney. Kumukuha siya ng the beauty in it. Although, ang tawag natin kasi doon may pagka-romanticism eh. Parang romanticize. Parang gusto niya sabihin dito is romanticize ng isang poet ang isang dull nature or yung isang uh, things that are perceived by the senses. Okay? So, may pagka-romanticism, di ba? Although kasunod kasi nito romantic period eh. Okay? So, he employs his creative faculty, imagination, and style of presentation to decorate the raw materials of nature. So, out from nothing, out from a dull nature, ang ginagawa raw ng poetry ay binibigyan niya ng mabubulaklak na description. Yan. That's imitation according to you. That's how another form of imitation can be reflected on. Ito naman, for Aristotle, human action is more important. But for Sidney, nature is important. So, iba lang naman yung ano rito ni ni Sidney. Pagkaman si Sidney talaga is tinitingnan niya rin yung kahalagahan ng human being, the existence of human being, pero mahalaga pa rin yung tinitingnan ni Sidney, yung nature. Okay? So, kung ano yung nakikita natin sa paligid natin. Kasi nga sabi niya, bakit natin nasabi nito na ni Sidney na nature is important? Because the role of the poetry is to decorate the nature in the poetry. Okay? So, yun. In Sidney's work, The Defense of Poetry, he displays knowledge of Horace and Plato. Okay, so, base pa lang dun sa minimension ko kanina sa inyo, may pagka-Plato nga ang work ni Sidney, or ang stand ni Sidney. So, according to Sidney, he states that poetry is an art of imitation. For so Aristotle termed it in his word mimesis, that is to say, a representing, counterfeiting, or figuring forth. To speak metaphorically, a speaking picture with its end is to teach and delight. Ito naman yung impluensya ni Aristotle kay Sidney, yung teach and delight. Yung kahalagahan ng nature, it's Plato. Okay? Yung teach and delight, it's Aristotle. Okay? So, sabi niya, as you teach poetry, there's always a delight. So, hybrid itong si Sidney. To cut the story short, hybrid yung stand niya when it comes to poetry. It's a mixture of the ideas of Plato and Aristotle. So, pagka-hybrid nga talaga siya. Right? Sidney himself, is an imitator. Okay, siya mismo sa sarili niya, pwede nating sabihin na siya mismo ay mayroon ding imitation. 'Di ba? Kasi, sabi nga niya, when we talk of imitation, during the Renaissance period in general, when they talk of imitation, is the imitation of other writers. Okay? Kay Plato at Aristotle, imitation of person and nature. Sa Renaissance, imitation of other writers. So, si Sidney, ini-emulate niya sa sarili niya yung mga teachings ni Aristotle and Plato. Hence, he himself is a product of imitation. Ayan. And, ito na, Sidney adapts elements from the early modern period of Aristotle and Horace to offer his own somewhat broader view of imitation. Okay? So, clear na nasabi natin na, okay? So, hybrid si Sidney. Kinonsider niya yung the value of nature ni Plato at si Aristotle naman yung value ng teach and delight. Okay. Ito mahalaga to. Gusto kong point out ito. May pagka-Platonian to eh. Sidney suggests three kinds of poetic imitation. First, poetry that did imitate the inconceivable excellences of God, as in the various poetical portions of the Old Testament. Okay, so I read an article. I forgot where I read it, but according to the article, there is a dual functions of men, and this can be reflected in most of the characters. If we're just going to describe characters in general briefly, these are the dual functions of characters, and generally the dual function of men. Okay? Godly and earthly. So, hindi ko matanda kung sa ko nabasa to, but ang ganda kasi nung sinabi niya rito na sa pangkalahatan, ang dual functions of man is godly and earthly. Because man, or human, is created from the, I call this, from the, ang Tagalog, hinulma tayo sang-ayon daw sa itsura ng Panginoong Diyos. Okay? So, godly. Pag sinabi natin godly, ito yung mga good things na ginagawa ng tao. A godlike actions. Pag sinabi natin godlike actions, ito yung banal-banal, mabuting pag-uugali. Another one, yun pa pagkayin yung earthly. Ito yung makamundong paghahangad ng tao. Yung the seven deadly sins. Those are earthly things. Yun yung sinasabi, earthly. Okay? So, halos lahat ng mga literary works, if we're going to describe them, ito lagi ang mensahe niya. God, that man function as godly and unearthly. Pansinin nyo, himay-himayin nyo ang halos lahat ng mga literary works. Okay? Makikita at makikita nyo doon lagi na ang isang character may pinoportray godly and earthly, or yung buong mensahe noong kwento or ng isang dula, isang kwento, mahati at mahati yung mensahe that man functions godly and functions earthly. Okay? Excuse me. Okay, so ito yung first point niya na imitate the conceivable excellences of God. Ito yun. That man, the first function of man is of course to act godly, doing good things, doing good deeds to others and to himself or herself. Okay? The second imitation na nakita ni Sidney, aside from doon sa imitation of the excellences of God, man doing godly things or doing earthly things, nakita niya rin doon that imitation is reflected by poet that deals with subject whose scope is philosophical, historical, and scientific. Okay. Third, imitation that leaves it free of the constraints imposed by Aristotle, wherein poets most properly do imitate to teach and delight, into imitate and to imitate, borrow nothing of what has been or shall be, but range only into the divine consideration of what may be and should be. Okay. Next, the truth value and didactic role of literature. Pag sinabi natin didactic, it has something to do with teaching. Okay, pagtuturo pa rin. So, truth value and didactic role of literature. So, paano ba rin na-reflect ng literature ang truth value at paano ba nagtuturo sa atin ang literature. So, sabi ni Sidney, didactic effect of a poem depends upon the poet's power to move. Diba sabi ni Sidney, spare poetry, blame the poet kung pangit man yun. Okay? So, kung magandang pagkakasulat ng isang poet sa isang literary works, then ma-attain yung didactic effect. Halimbawa ay yung mga works nila Shakespeare's or nila Dante Alighieri, etc., etc., and they're able to influence a lot, and it is an indication of poet's power to move or power to teach. Okay, it depends upon the effective quality of poetry. And may pagka-literary criticism na Okay, so maganda ba pagkakasulat? Okay ba yung pagkakasulat? Okay. Yan. Then we have the didactic role during the Renaissance. Okay, so I've already mentioned to you that they should reflect teach and delight, na habang nagtuturo ka, dapat meron ding amusement na nakukuha yung readers. Okay? This next is the classical unities. Na-mention na natin classical unities na to eh. Okay, sa I think na pahapyawan ko lang siya doon kay Aristotle. Kay Aristotle tong classical itong unity of place. Okay, so Renaissance writers added the doctrine of unity of place to Aristotle's original demand for the unity of action and time. Kasi 'di ba sa tragedy, meron tayong tinatawag na as the setting, yung time and place. So when we talk of unity of place, the setting of the place should have one place. Ibig sabihin ay tama o tumpak dapat ang pagkakalatag o pagkaka-describe or pagkakahayag doon sa isang literary works. So, Aristotle never mentioned the unity of place at all. Ayan. Although, hindi galing sa kanya yon, pero yung konsepto kasi ng pagpapaliwanag ay sa kanya binase. Kaya, during the Renaissance period, kay Aristotle nila binigay yung credit ng unity of place. Again, never na mention ni Aristotle ang unity of place. It's just so happened that his concept of the arrangement of the setting that should be placed in one in one place, kumbaga arranged properly yung time and place sa play. So, yung konseptong yun, inattribute nila ito kay Plato, hence they attribute unity of place to Aristotle. Sorry, Aristotle, not Plato. Aristotle. Okay? He is not the author of it. It was foisted on him by Renaissance critics of Italy and France. Just like what I mentioned. Okay? So again, pag pinag-usapan natin yung unities, the classical unities or the unities of place, it has something to do with the unity of action and time. So, sa literary criticism during their period, tinignan natin yung theory of imitation, tinignan natin yung truth value in didactic role, at tinignan natin yung classical unity. Again, napapasok pa rin yung unity of place kasi nga, there are two major genres during the Renaissance period, the poetry and the drama. And we have the verisimilitude, or the appearance of being true or real. Okay? So, yung may pagka-realist na pinag-uusapan natin dito. Renaissance critics asserted that poetry must be very similar in two respects. So, it must imitate objects that are real, not fantastic. So, clear na dapat totoo yung ini-imitate. So, sabi nila, ang mga literary works dapat daw ay totoo ang reflect. Pangalawa, the manner of imitation must appear probable or at least possible to the audience. Makaka-relate dapat ang audience doon sa ini-imitate nila. Okay? So, yan yung notion of verisimilitude. The use of vernacular. When we talk of vernacular, that is the language that they are using in literature. So the Renaissance writers were obliged to address controversial issues of meter, rhyming, versification, and vernacular tanks. Okay? So, isa rin to sa mga tinitingnan nila. Tama ba yung ginagamit? Di ba nga si Philip Sidney bumuo siya ng grupo na kung saan ang trabaho ng grupo nila ay himay-himayin ang mga literary works, pag-aralan. So, dito talaga makikita mo kung paano nila tinitingnan yung paghihimay-himay na yun. At dito nila hinalehay yung tamang pagsusulat o pag-aayos ng estilo sa pagsusulat ng mga tula. Okay? And the definition of poetic genres such as narrative and drama. So, binalikan, di ba kung gagamitin natin si Aristotle dito iba yung kanyang definition under ang narrative tsaka drama ng poetry. Okay? However, the Renaissance writers wrote in the ancient forms of genres of epic, tragedy, and comedy to attain the ancient spirit. They mold their style upon that of the great ancients. So, hindi pa rin bagaman yung kanilang that they are in the period of rebirth, makikita pa rin talaga natin doon. Base na rin doon sa paliwanag ni Sidney. Si Sidney mismo, pwede natin gawing example, ay may impluensya pa rin siya ng great ancients, especially Plato and Aristotle. Doon sa kanyang mga concepts na pinaliwanag. Kaya nga 'di ba naging hybrid si Philip Sidney when defending the poetry. Okay, so the invention of new mixed genres. Okay, I've already discussed this to you, the tragicomedy. Okay. Yan yung example ng mixed genres. Okay, the use of rhyme in poetry. Renaissance writers rejected the regular, stress-based alliterative meter of medieval poets. Okay, medyo technical na itong stress-based alliterative. Ito na yung ginagamitan natin ng call that the iamb, the trochee, ayan, yun na yung mga yun. The iambic pentameter, the trochee, etc., etc. Yung mga rhyme scheme. They rejected rhyme as an unclassical barbarism. They searched for a new metrical basis for poetry, eventually stimulated the growth of blank verse. Okay, where free verse was originated, blank verse muna. Okay, so it can be reflected from the works of Petrarch and in Shakespeare during the Renaissance period that they have established their own style of writing. Doon pa lang sa kanilang bilang ng kanilang mga words, yung kanilang mga meters, sa kanilang sonnet, we can really see the differences between the Petrarchan sonnet and Shakespearean sonnet, which are still followed ng iba, yung mga very particular of the rhyme. But kasi sa atin maging 14 lines lang, okay na sonnet na yon. Pero kasi it's very difficult for us to follow the iambic, the iamb na sinusunod ni Shakespeare kasi let's understand na iba yung tunog ng English sa tunog ng American English. Yung mga tunog ng sa England is different. Okay, then the relative values of quantitative and qualitative verse. Renaissance writers introduced classical quantitative meters based on length of syllables rather than stress into vernacular languages. Okay, kasi nga mahirap if you're going to follow the rule of stress. So sila, ang ginawa na lang nila is that they are into the meters alone. Yung stress niya, yan yung papasok sina Iam, sina Trochee, si Anapest. Yan, si Anapest, Trochee, si Iam. Yan, magkakapatid na yan. Okay, that ends my discussion on the Renaissance period. Okay, so thank you. You have filled in again your learning bit.